Hi, my name is Andre Gonoella. Welcome to Back to the Burn Bag podcast. Folks, it's a very interesting time to be reading and watching national security. It's a very weird time to want to be in national security. It also feels like a bit of a stupid time to be in national security, to be honest. On today's episode, we're breaking down the growing controversy known as Signalgate, a digital age national security scandal that erupted after a journalist was accidentally added to a Signal group chat among senior Trump officials, which includes Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, Vice President J.D. Vance, probably the highest ranking official of all of them in there, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, DNI Tulsi Gabbard. To be honest, it seems like the only person not in the chat was President Trump himself. So the chat revealed sensitive U.S. military plans for airstrikes on Houthi targets in Yemen, with precise strike timing discussed just hours before the operation took place. While the White House has sought to downplay the breach, calling the messages non-classified, the Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg, who was added by Mike Waltz into the chat, released a full thread, which has raised questions about operational security and judgment at the highest levels of our national security establishment and government. Just today, the Washington Post reported that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and his staff was also using Gmail to conduct government emails with. It's all so strange to me, to be honest. It's all so strange. So, to better understand what's going on, I'm being joined by Mark Zaid. He is a renowned national security attorney based in Washington, D.C., known for his sharp legal mind and his advocacy on behalf of whistleblowers, intelligence officers, and journalists. Mark has built a career navigating the most sensitive and complex cases involving government secrecy, whistleblower protection, and the Freedom of Information Act. And he's also the founder of the James Madison Project and co-founder of Whistleblower Aid. He has been repeatedly recognized as one of DC's top lawyers, and as the National Law Journal once said, if Agent Mulder ever needed a lawyer, Zaid would be his man. So, Mark, thanks for joining me here today.
Thank you, Andre. I need one of these publications to come up with a new television line reference because I don't know how many people remember who Agent Mulder is any longer.
To be honest, I didn't even know who he is. What show was he from?
It's
Or
from
what?
the X-Files.
Oh, gee, I was born in
That's back in the
1997.
90s.
So, I was an infant when that was coming out. But, gee, Mark, as I said, to me, it feels like a very weird time to be in national security. I just sort of gave the down low of what happened with Signalgate. What are your immediate reactions to what's been going on?
Yeah, the first thing I think is I am so tired of the Washington, D.C. hypocrisy. The notion, and it goes both ways. I'm not relieving anybody of it. Right now, the attention is on the Republicans because they're the ones in power. So the level of hypocrisy that we see with these national security operational blunders, particularly giving the fervor by which actually most of those on that Signal conversation, how they criticized Hillary Clinton for, her emails, literally even recently, again, Pam Bondi, in response to Signalgate, said, well, if you really want to talk about mishandling of classified information, why don't we talk about those emails from 2015, 2016, right? Forget the classified documents that were in President Trump's bathroom down at Mar-a-Lago. But three things strike me from the Signalgate aspect of it. One is, look, a mistake was made by adding Jeff Goldberg to the conversation. I don't know how it happened. Creating Signal chats is not as easy as like mistakenly sending somebody an email with the wrong person as you type in the
Yeah.
name and you realize you put it to the wrong Matt or Marsha or whatever. But it can happen, and it particularly depends on who, how the address listing was in Waltz's phone, right? But more importantly, that's a blunder, huge one, huge. Thankfully, it was Jeff Goldberg they sent it to, and not someone who either didn't care if it was real or not, or was malicious and had revealed it before the operation had taken place, because that could have been disastrous for our men and women who were engaged in the operation. That's the first thing. The second thing is the use of Signal, a commercial software application, to have what is absolutely a classified conversation. I could care less what those in the administration are saying, that it's not classified. Even Republicans on the Hill are saying, give me a break. That was clearly classified information. And then third, the fact that they set the conversations to delete in violation of federal records laws and raises the questions of what other conversations were you having on this device and others, as we'll talk about, that now are no longer preserved for history.
I mean, what's shocking to me is that there are group chats involving the planning of wedding proposals that seem to be more secretive, taken with care than this Signal group chat in which we were planning a bombing of the Houthis. But Mark, what exactly was the classified or sensitive information that Secretary Hegseth disclosed in the group chat? Why was it classified?
So the governing executive order 13526 has been in place since 2009, but these guidelines or parameters, I should say, have been in place for decades. And the executive order even just talks about military plans and operations. You can't get more obvious when you are saying such and such aircraft are going to be bombing such and such targets at such and such time. And whether or not a week after it happens, that would still be classified, or there would be harm by declassifying it, that's a totally separate topic. Believe me, I have fought for 30 plus years as a lawyer to declassify information. I have had authorized access for classified information for many, many, many years. I have seen lots of overclassified details. I've seen lots of information where I'm just shaking my head going, why in the world is that classified? But how anyone with a straight face can say in real time, the Secretary of Defense, in communications with the Vice President of the United States, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, etc., are discussing operational plans to bomb a foreign military target, how that would not be considered classified is just like blows my mind.
And I mean, look, like when I was reading through the texts and you had the specific timing for when the planes were going to be in the air, when the bombings were going to actually occur. I mean, if some nefarious actor, like say the Russians, had gotten a hold of that information, they had about 2 hours to notify the Houthis, who could quickly, move their stuff, prepare a counterattack that could very much risk American lives. There could be American lives at the bottom of the ocean, unfortunately, right? So, I mean, that's what's shocking to me about all of this. I mean, the Trump administration has sought to claim the information was unclassified. Some are claiming that, like, okay, maybe the Secretary of Defense can like declassify things at his whim or will or whatever. Uh, what's the flaw in that argument?
So, for one thing, certainly the Secretary of Defense has declassification authority. There's obviously nothing within the text messages that shows that he was ever trying to exercise that. He can't declassify information that doesn't belong to him. So the conversations or the text messages that the DNI posted, that the Secretary of State posted, that the National Security Advisor posted, those are in their equities.
Hmm.
Now, maybe they were classified, maybe they were not standing alone, but it isn't as if Secretary Hegseth is in control of this Signal chat for purposes of classification. And in any event, it's a distraction because the issue is not, is it declassified after the fact, which they legally can do? It's, was it classified at the time? And you're again having this conversation on a non-secure commercial app that is not designed for classified information.
Yeah, so let's dig into the commercial app aspect of this. I know Signal itself, I mean, it's similar to sort of like WhatsApp, but it's generally more popular with these government officials. I've noticed it being used by DoD folks, by like congressional folks, and so on. Why is it so popular with so many folks in government, and why is it so risky? I mean, why are secure systems used for this type of stuff?
So look, it was created for the purpose of everyone to be able to use. It is encrypted end to end. That means the likelihood of anyone being able to intercept the message as it's being sent is pretty slim. I mean, you'd have to be, there are some flaws as I understand it. I'm not a cyber expert. But of course, once it's received, that sent and received, the vulnerability expands because all you have to do is gain access to that person's phone, whether through extraction of the data or if you physically grab the phone. So, right, so there was concerns raised that one of the recipients was in Russia at the time. Now his response was, and I don't have any reason to doubt it, was my phone wasn't with me. I only had my government phone, which raised the separate issue of, okay, so you're having these conversations work related on your personal phone, which is an issue separately, because these documents, these conversations are just as legitimate or valid as a memo that, is handwritten or typed and printed. There is a record preservation requirement that they have to ensure that the information is protected to go to the National Archives, to go to a presidential library, in years subsequent. And they are taking those steps to apparently make sure that that doesn't happen. That raises a lot of legality concerns, of course. Now, Signal, it also can destruct the messages. You can set it to destroy, to delete the messages. That is a favorite, app for everybody. Sometimes for that. We use it a lot as lawyers back and forth. I don't have a document preservation requirement. I'm sure a lot of people who cheat on their spouses use the Signal app as well. So pros and cons, if that's a good thing or not. That's not what the intent of it was for. But nonetheless, it is a favorite app, and there are protocols about whether it can be used or not by the government for governmental purposes. And in fact, in the week prior to this, the NSA cautioned its employees about use of the app because there were some vulnerabilities that were identified.
So, as you're telling me all of this, to any national security person, I mean, to anyone going through a clearance, to anyone holding a clearance, to anyone who has even some modicum of familiarity with how this stuff works, even with like CUI, for example, right? Like how could this have possibly happened with so many senior national security leaders? Because to me, again, it seems so stupid, right? Like, how is this not common sense? That's what I'm trying to wrap my mind around. That's what I'm struggling to wrap my mind around.
So I think actually there's an easy answer to that question. That does not, I do not wrestle my mind around that because they don't care. Is the
Okay.
basic. It was convenient. Look, they all, given their positions, have access to secure communication devices. They might not have had it on their person at the time. They might have had to have gone to the office. They might have had to have found their aide who's with them, who has the proper laptop for secure communications. It wasn't convenient in the moment for each of them to participate. In fact, we saw, for those who look at the chat, there are two MRs, MAR, I think it is, or I forget whatever his middle initial is. But there's two of them, Marco Rubio, Marco whatever Rubio, because it looks like he had two accounts. Anyone who knows how the app works, he had two accounts that were set up for it, two phones. Now, it could have been a desktop computer, could have been another cell device, or could have been a tablet, whatever. But it was two phone numbers that were separately set up to be on the app for whatever reason, which raises some other concerns. We haven't had any, I think, elaboration on that
Yeah,
aspect of it. I don't think Marco Rubio's commented it that I'm aware of. I might have missed it.
I don't think so either.
But I think it was just, it was for the same reasons why I criticized, along with these Republicans, Hillary Clinton's use of a private server at the time. I was constantly regularly on Fox News and elsewhere. I mean, I represented the Daily Mail, a far right conservative publication, in a FOIA lawsuit about it because it was so stupid. How did her senior officials not tell her this was the wrong thing to do as a Secretary of State? And the same thing applies to these folks now, but in even a worse way, because they had the benefit of seeing how ridiculous and misguided Hillary Clinton's steps were, yet they still did something similar.
And it's crazy with Secretary Clinton. It was one cabinet official in theory, right? With this,
And it was one of
everyone.
the reasons why she wasn't prosecuted is because you would have had to have prosecuted dozens of people. It wasn't just her that was doing it. You couldn't have just separated her from it. And there were, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why there was a positive, reasonable decision not to do anything with it. But it doesn't detract from the inappropriateness of what she did and the lessons learned, which clearly the Trump cabinet has not.
So, I mean, going back to the Clinton case, because I mean, for many of our younger viewers or younger listeners, I mean, they know about the emails, quote unquote, but what actually went on there? I mean, like, what was the situation?
So, as I recall, it's a decade ago, right? She
Yeah.
created a private server that she had at home that enabled more fluid, easier communications with some of her folks. And it wasn't intended to be for use on classified conversations. There was some spillover, and some of it where it looked like there was a miscommunication as to what like the letter C meant for confidential, which is usually what we don't see any longer for classified information, but it is
Yeah.
a classification designation. But it could also look like a C, like a copyright C with a C in a circle. But they were forwarding a lot of text, a lot of emails. So you would see the message, and unless you scrolled all the way down, you wouldn't necessarily see that there was a marking on that email. There's also a problem, just like with the Signal conversation, there's no markings. It's not a governmental system. There are text messaging systems for the government that would properly mark the text. In fact, if you go to if you're at the CIA and you message a fellow colleague so that you're going to go meet them at the food court in the CIA, it's automatically marked classified because that's how the settings are. Um, Obviously, this was not that case. And I mean, there were other issues about whether or not post facto, looking at it afterwards, would that information or should that information have been classified? In many ways, what we're doing now in looking at these text messages and going, I could not think of anything that would be more clearly and
Yep.
easily classified than, again, in real time military planning of operational strikes.
Because you can use that information to hit back if you're the Houthis. You can use
Yeah.
that information to kill American lives. I mean, that's why.
Yeah, and Tulsi Gabbard testified at the global threats hearing, which unfortunately for them came right after this broke in the news,
Unfortunately.
and she was asked by one of the senators or House members, I forget which, isn't it true that the Houthis have a missile land to air missile strike, whatever capabilities, base whatever, to hit a plane? Yes. And the answer was yes, they do. So if that had been sent to a journalist with less ethics, or frankly thought it was a joke or real, because Goldberg wasn't sure. He's like, this can't be real. I think
Yeah.
someone's trying to prank me. If somebody had just said, I received the strangest text messages, and it looks like it's cabinet officers, and I think I'm being pranked, but you know what, everybody? I'm gonna post it on Twitter, on X at 11:45 Saturday morning, and they're talking about striking Yemen in 2 hours. And just like you mentioned, if the Russians had seen that, which they probably would have because they monitor all of this as well, and they notified their friends, the Houthis, we might be missing some pilots.
Like, hey guys, get a load of this. Like, look what I just got. It's April Fool's Day, like we're recording today, right?
Right.
I remember like when the Osama bin Laden raid happened in 2011, I recall there was one guy who was in that town in Abbottabad who like tweeted out like I hear choppers coming in and all of that. And like it was minutes, right? Like it was minutes before like the Pakistani Air Force was mobilized and all of that. Like this thing can literally take minutes. But
Yeah.
Mark, you've referenced, the fact that obviously they've broken some laws, or you believe they've broken some laws. How many laws do you believe the group chat actually broke? Like what laws are we actually talking about?
Well, for one, not that I think there would be, even if Democrats were in power today, um, there were likely violations of the Espionage Act for mishandling classified information. I don't think it would have been appropriate to prosecute someone for it, but uh, this would often certainly lead to an investigation and the possible revocation of someone's security clearance, which all of those folks do have. As cabinet officers, they go through, the vice president does not. Uh, but the other cabinet officers go through the same background investigation that the janitor goes through at the Defense Department to have access to classified facilities. Now, more detailed, obviously, for cabinet members because they get actual access to the information. But nonetheless, it's the same security clearance. There are guidelines for mishandling classified information. I have had clients who have been punished, penalized, lost their clearance, or proceeded to lose it for far, far less. For instances where the communications or the information was never compromised, but
Yeah.
it was mishandled. Or I've had clients who were fired for forwarding unclassified information from their work phones or work computers to their home devices simply because they wanted to work on it at home. And that was deemed a violation of the regulations of particularly the Department of Homeland Security, and they've been terminated as a result.
So you mentioned the Espionage Act. What is the Espionage Act, and what are some of the notable cases that, our general public may have heard of when we talk about the Espionage Act?
So the Espionage Act dates back to 1917 and hasn't been amended since the Korean conflict almost 75 years ago. What's most notable about it, and the two instances where people would know about the Espionage Act, is what it seems to stand for, the prosecution of spies. The Rosenbergs, it was the anniversary the other day of one of the Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, either the conviction or the execution. And Prosecuting spies is one part of it. Prosecuting individuals who leak classified information to the press is another aspect that we see fairly often, not common, but often enough because it's very noteworthy. So we hear about it. Now, I said classified information, and I said that because that's the easier aspect for people to understand what we're talking about. But the act does not talk about classified information. It talks about national defense information because, again, it was written 75 to 100 years ago. And we didn't use the term classified information. When cases are prosecuted today, it almost invariably it involves classified information. Doesn't need to. And if anyone's going to tell me national defense information doesn't include, even if unclassified, the operational planning details of a military strike, then I don't know what would.
Gee, so what about the Federal Records Act? You mentioned something about how Signal destroying messages or erasing messages can be problematic in a legal sense for government officials.
Yeah, so this is an act that requires preservation of records. Now, it doesn't mean you can't use personal devices. There are rules that allow for that, especially because in the last 30 years, obviously, the invention and grand use of cell phones and internet technology, things like that, where more people are working virtually or teleworking, etc., and you're bringing it's all electronic information. There are protocols in place. So, for example, plus the fact that anyone who knows or has spent time in government or has worked alongside the government systems break down often. They can't,
Yeah.
people can't log into their accounts. There's something down with the system, so they turn to their personal devices. So uh, you can use your personal device if, for example, you send an email or a text message, but you link in your government account. you forward it to your government account. There are protocols for something like that, but not to just simply use Gmail accounts or WhatsApp or Signal without taking the proper steps to preserve it for the U.S. government. I don't know. I just don't remember off the top of my head whether there are criminal penalties in the Federal Records Act. I got to double check on that. But without a doubt, if you are violating that, it would be grounds for disciplinary action, termination, and certainly loss of security clearance.
So you don't remember off the top of your head, but I mean, with the Espionage Act in particular, you mentioned that bit about sort of national defense information. And if that's violated, I mean, like how difficult would it be to sort of have criminal liability in this particular situation? Would that be a difficult thing to prove for the Secretary of Defense, for others who sort of disclose national security information, classified information in this context?
Well, if you want to believe the statements made by many of the participants in that Signal chat when they were talking about Hillary Clinton's emails a decade ago, where they indicated that they wanted to prosecute Hillary Clinton under 18 USC 793 F, which has a gross negligent provision in it that you grow. I forget how the exact words, I don't have it in front of me, but essentially that you gross negligently handled the information. And there have been some prosecutions under that provision, not many, because it's hard in an intent statute for
Yeah.
criminality to use a standard of gross negligence. Again, that was written 100 years ago, and they just haven't modified it, and they just don't usually rely on it. But I said at the time, I don't think she should be prosecuted because, again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, tons of people would have to be prosecuted because so many people were misusing this personal server. But in this case as well, the proper response would be for looking at the mishandling and determining whether or not that person should still have a clearance. Now, clearly, this administration is not going to take any action against any of them. If anything does happen, it would likely be, relieving them of their responsibilities. There's been talk about firing Mike Waltz. Supposedly, they decided not to. Now, with this news story, maybe the pressure will build up. I'm not necessarily advocating for that. That's not my call to do. But usually when there's some scandal like that, it would typically be someone would get fired. But in the future, would that person get another security clearance? This type of scenario would be taken into consideration.
This may be a dumb question, but why is there so much talk about firing Waltz specifically, but not Hegseth? Because Waltz, I mean, if we're talking about the levels of severity of what went wrong, I feel like adding Goldberg to the chat itself is not as bad as then disclosing classified information in that chat. Waltz added Goldberg, Hegseth disclosed the information.
I think, at least from my perception of following the story, it was because Waltz was by adding Goldberg, he created the scandal, the
Okay.
controversy, right? It never would have been known other than that. So the ire is directed at him rather than what the contents were, because those contents were supposed to be maintained as secret, not necessarily secret, classified secret, which they were, but secret in the sense that no one in the public would have or should have ever known about him, and especially because those messages would have self-deleted, like in Mission Impossible, which is another outdated television reference that I'm making from a television show back in the 1960s.
Well,
Although I guess it was a
we had
movie
movies.
with Tom Cruise as
The
well.
last one's coming out this spring, I think.
Oh, is there another? All right, yeah. So,
Trailers are
the
out.
tape will
So.
self-destruct in 5 minutes after you listen to it. That's what they wanted.
Yeah, so the young folks still get those references, and we're getting ready to see that. But uh, there are others who are supporters of the administration who are, I think, making very flawed arguments, trying to not only say like, "Oh, okay, it's not a big deal, this information's not, that bad," who are instead now trying to go after Jeffrey Goldberg, saying that, "Oh, maybe he should be the one who is punished for all of this." Would the Atlantic or Jeffrey Goldberg face any liability? Did they break any laws by merely being in the group chat or even publishing those transcripts after the fact?
So the irony of the argument by the administration that, oh, nothing's classified actually gives protection to Jeffrey Goldberg since he was the one who published the text messages in the Atlantic. I actually would have preferred he had not done that initially. I had advocated before he wrote the article that contained the messages that he should give all of the messages over to the congressional intelligence committees in both the House and the Senate. Let them deal with it. But the administration went on the attack and said nothing's classified. So he felt, apparently, from what they said in the article, that they were justified in publishing that information. Now, again, theoretically, they could obviously be prosecuted for national defense information, unclassified, but that would look the optics of that would look pretty horrible if they did it. I think if anything, and certainly the right wing has tried to manipulate it in this way, as to whether or not there was an ethical responsibility for Goldberg to have raised his hand and said, guys, I'm not, or did you mean for me to be in this
Yeah.
conversation? I don't, it was sort of like if you saw the Saturday Night Live open cold skit that they did in the wake of this, where the cabinet officers were in a conversation with high school teenage girls, and they're like, "Guys, why are you in this conversation with us?" They raised it to them, like, "I don't think you should be here." He obviously did not, but he part of why because he said he didn't even think this was real. He,
Yeah.
he wasn't. He thought he was maybe being pranked, and that this was an effort to make him look bad if he had said something publicly. But that's a good journalist question, and I'm sure many journalism classes are raising that. And I don't have a good answer for that because I'm not a journalist, so I don't have to worry about it. But legally speaking, no, I don't think he crossed any lines.
So would he have crossed any lines had he published the transcripts in that initial article when he broke the story?
So possibly, look, this happens all the time about entities, media entities, and journalists publishing what the government considers to be classified information.
Yeah.
Now, no journalist has been prosecuted for disclosing national defense information, other than if you want to call Julian Assange a journalist at WikiLeaks. But pushing that aside, that's a subject of separate debate. A mainstream journalist entity, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Caller, it doesn't matter on the ideological framework. Um, Only one journalist entity in World War II was brought before a grand jury. Nobody knew about it at the time for publishing national defense information, but the decision was do not go forward because it would reveal, problems in that case with the Battle of Midway in World War II, that we had broken the Japanese codes. So he could have faced problems under the law if he had published it. And I dare say, and I have been saying, that I expect during the Trump administration that a journalist, whether media entity like the New York Times or an individual journalist, will be charged under the Espionage Act for publishing national defense information. I think it's just a matter of time before something is so perceived as so embarrassing to the president and others senior official in the administration that they're going to cross that imaginary line that every administration prior, both Republican and Democrat alike, had felt they could not cross and should not cross.
So let's say there was some lower level officer who had done the same thing. This sort of leaked out, and his seniors got a hold of it and they found out. What would be the punishment for these lower level officers? I mean, what could they expect?
Normally, I would expect that individual's clearance would be suspended, if not revoked, And regardless of whether that pathway was pursued, the likelihood the person would be disciplined, if not indeed up to the extent of being fired, terminated from their job. Would they have been prosecuted? Who knows? If it was just the notion of inadvertently adding
Yeah.
someone to a chat and you didn't know about it at the time, right? And you disclose the classified information, the intent, the intentionality wouldn't likely be there, but there would be repercussions without a doubt, in a normal world, which we are not in right now.
Gotcha. So, I mean, do you think there will actually be any consequences aside from maybe someone getting fired? I mean, could there be any consequences with, a more politically aligned Justice Department? I mean, if not the Justice Department, I mean, what other checks would there be?
So I do not think there will be any immediate repercussions for this. I think, for one thing, the news cycle moves so fast with so
Yeah.
many scandals and big time stories that it's really easy to forget, to move on too quickly. I do think that this will be viewed as one of many problematic situations that at some point in time, I think there will be a straw that breaks the camel's back, whether it's for an individual cabinet member who then gets released, fired, relieved of their responsibilities, or Republican members in Congress who decide enough is enough, that operational national security has been violated and this can't be tolerated. And you might see some investigations from the congressional side, even on the Republican side. You might see some inspector general investigations, of which it is said that there will be one into this. And some of those folks still are independent. And we'll see how that all contributes. I think it's far more because of the way this administration operates and the people who are in it, which is deflect, deny, deceive, challenge, turn it on its head, attack Jeff Goldberg as if it was his fault. Like, how did he get into our conversation? And suggesting maybe somehow he nefariously got into a Signal conversation, which is just outright ludicrous to even think that. I doubt he even knows how one would do that. I don't know
Yeah,
how one would
how
do
would
that.
you?
Yeah. But I really do think uh, it will build up. What I can't tell you or predict is when that build up will happen. And in fact, I probably would say it will differ from person to person. Republicans, particularly in Congress, or Republican voters and Trump
Yeah.
supporters. It will differ. Where's that line in the sand that this was too far?
So on another topic, Mark, while I still have you here on this session, I wanted to also ask you about the administration's attacks on law firms and lawyers. I mean, what exactly is going on? Because we've been seeing this trickle in the news. I've been seeing my friends who are in the legal field post stories about this. But what is the Trump administration doing, and what is your assessment of why is this happening, and to what extent is this legal?
So I thought I was special in the early days of the Trump administration when I got singled out as basically the one nonpartisan, non-Democrat lawyer who was being targeted. And now there's so many others who are being targeted, all these law firms, and I feel kind of left out because I didn't get an executive order. I just got a couple of tweets, a New York Post article, and a White House memo. Although I was mentioned with two, with President, let's see, President Biden, Vice President Harris, former
I
Secretary of
think
State.
you were fifth. You were fifth
I was
on
like
that
fourth.
list.
I think I was fourth in one of
That's a
them,
good ranking.
which which is wild because I'm sure the vast majority of people who read the documents were like, "Who the hell is this Zaid guy?" I never heard of this guy. It's very strange. But I'll
Clearance
tell
is
you,
being revoked, right? That's what you're
with
referring
clearances being
to.
revoked. But I'll tell you exactly what's going on because Trump the Trump the Butcher is my new name for him. And the reference is to Dick the Butcher, which was a character in Shakespeare's Henry VI play 500 years ago, give or take. And Dick the Butcher was the right hand thug of another character. And they were plotting to engage in a coup and take over the country wherever the heck they were. Uh, and they realized in order to do that, they needed to kill all the lawyers. Now, when I say Dick the Butcher, Trump the Butcher, most people probably don't remember or have any clue what I'm talking about. They do know the phrase, let's kill all the lawyers, because that's become a fun catchphrase, in television, in movies, etc. And it is usually used in a derogatory manner of, oh, you lawyers, you're a bunch of sleazeballs, which I got called by President Trump in his first administration. You're ambulance chasers. You know what? We should just get rid of you, because they know that line from that Shakespeare play. But the irony is, it was a compliment to lawyers. The reason why they wanted to kill the lawyers was the lawyers would have prevented the wannabe authoritarians from taking over the country, because the lawyers would have stopped them by the rule of law. The Trump administration is attacking its perceived legal enemies in a partisan ideological way that if you read the executive orders as to why the law firms are being targeted, you could easily substitute that law firm's name for some right-wing Republican law firm's name, because they do the same thing. They're being lawyers. They're representing individuals. In fact, President Trump was represented by lawyers who are now predominantly in his administration as part of the Mar-a-Lago document prosecution. And those lawyers were given security clearances properly in order to defend him, as they needed to do and act as lawyers. But in order to kill all the lawyers so that they can retain power and move towards authoritarianism, or patrimonialism, as I've been told is a more appropriate term for what he's doing, which is he doesn't like bureaucracy. Authoritarians generally have bureaucracy in place. They create secret police. They create entities to run their so-called deep state. That's not what this administration wants. This administration wants to run this government as its own business to serve the personal interests of Donald Trump and those surrounding it or within it. And that means you need to get rid of people like me, who are the lawyers who are challenging in court through the rule of law the actions that they are undertaking, which so far has been generally successful because the courts have been upholding the rule of law. We'll see how long that lasts, and we'll see how long more so that the Trump administration abides by any court decisions that it doesn't like, or demand, as it has, the impeachment of judges simply because they don't like the rulings.
So, is the administration stretching the limits of its executive power? I mean, are we in uncharted territory? Have we seen administrations try to do this to perhaps a lesser extent before? Or, I mean, you just mentioned, right, like the judges are sort of ruling in favor of law firms who are, contesting this. But in a way, is this sort of, quote, legal so far?
So I think what we have seen is we have never seen an administration engage in so much conduct that moves to push the powers of the executive branch to extremes than ever before. We've seen pockets, all right? We've seen the Nixon administration undertake certain steps that obviously led to his resignation. We have seen in the McCarthy era in the 1950s, where if you were connected to a communist party member, or even perceived to be, that an anonymous allegation against you could lead to the revocation of your security clearance. Anyone who saw the Oppenheimer film a couple of years ago, that was exactly spot on what was happening. That was a real case. What was happening in the 1950s. Or there's possibly a reason why President Trump is so enamored by President Andrew Jackson, our seventh president, because it is rumored, no one knows for sure, but it is said that in 1832, when he was engaging in attacks on Native Americans, our indigenous population, the Supreme Court ruled against him. And he said, well, you and what army are going to enforce that decision? And that is a real fear by way of a constitutional crisis as to where we would go. Because what would happen if the Trump administration said, any administration, executive branch said, we're not going to abide by this federal court ruling, because the way to enforce that would be, for example, the U.S. Marshal Service, which is controlled by the executive branch, law enforcement, controlled by the executive branch, I suppose military, controlled by the executive branch. Big problem.
So is this basically like a big hole in the system that we've just been hoping would never have to be touched?
Yeah, see, the difference between this administration and ever before is that all the administrations generally before have recognized what norms exist.
Hmm.
Journalists weren't indicted under the Espionage Act, not because the law doesn't permit it. It absolutely does. It was because the policy decisions were in place in both Republican and Democrat administrations that it wasn't the right policy step to pursue. This administration, there are no norms. We saw that in the first Trump administration. We are now seeing it much more organized and with speed than ever before, that they are just going to push the envelopes to expand executive power beyond what most ever believed should be done. So they're testing it. And they have nothing to lose, frankly, by doing that, because the worst thing that happens to them is that the court shuts them down and says, no, you went too far. So it goes back to status quo. But if they gain any traction, they have gained additional executive branch power. So we are seeing exploitation of gaps. The Alien Enemies Act, the deportation cases that are now being litigated through courts. The Trump administration is using the Alien Enemies Act, an act that was authored in the late 1790s and has only been used several times in our history, 250-year history, not because they can't use it, but because the question is, can they use it? So they are using it in reliance and now finding out whether they can or not. Nothing to lose.
As we wrap this conversation up, why should the general public care about this, right? Like, I mean, it may seem pretty clear, but I mean, if you're just some blue collar worker, right, like coming home from work, seeing this stuff on the evening news, you're seeing all the sound bites come on, and you're like, okay, great. Like, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for them?
So for something like that, and this is where the problem lies, of course, because until it impacts individuals across the United States, they might not care. And that's why the notion of the Alien Enemies Act case in particular is a really difficult one, because it's like, okay, if these are foreign illegal gang members who are committing crimes, I don't want them here. I'm all for that. Yeah, get rid of these people. Do it legally with due process, of course, because maybe they're not foreign gang members who are here illegally or committed crimes. But I always want to bring back to the famous poem back in World War II by the pastor, who essentially said something to the effect in response to National Socialism, Nazi Germany, right? They came for the socialists, but I wasn't a socialist, so I didn't say anything. They came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist, so I didn't say anything. They came for the Jews, but I wasn't Jewish, so I didn't say anything. And then he goes through the litany, and finally, after like 12 lines, and then they came for me, and there was nobody left to say that, you shouldn't come for me. Americans need to be concerned about executive branch overreach, judicial branch overreach, congressional overreach. This is why we have the rule of law. This is why we have a constitution. This is why we have three branches of government to balance each other out. And one of them taking on too much power creates a situation that can be to the detriment of us all. And if we don't speak out when it's not impacting us, there may be no one left to speak out when it does.
On that note, Mark, thank you so much for joining me here today. This was a great discussion on a very timely, pertinent, and concerning issue. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Andre. My pleasure.